Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ahmed on the first episode of Ahmed Talks, keeping it simple. I have my first guest, Dr. Rapoport, and thank you, Dr. Rapoport, for accepting my invitation. It's an honor.
To be here.
All right, so I'm going to give a small intro about Dr. Rapoport. He received an undergraduate degree in physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Rapoport attended the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and received his MD in 1974, way before I was born. He has been involved in clinical research since 1979 and is currently the director of the Sleep Medicine Research Program at Mount Sinai, also my boss. Dr. Rapoport has a long-standing interest in the physiology of sleep, disordered breathing, sleep apnea, and snoring. And Dr. Rapoport, thank you for being here again. And I guess I'm going to start with you with the first question. Is something that people, would like to know, especially, with your expertise. How can I get a better night's sleep?
So that's obviously a very, very hot question. Everybody wants to know the answer. And I think that it breaks up into two parts. The first part, I would say, I can speak to a little bit, although this is not my main area of expertise. And the other part is a lot more complicated. The first part is, how can you not do any harm? Because a lot of us living in civilized environment that we live in cities with lights, with a temptation to go out and party at night, sometimes to work much too long and into the night, with jet lag, which we'll get into perhaps later on in this discussion. We do a lot of things that are counter to our biology.
Right.
And so the short part the part that I think is most established is you can help your sleep if you're doing something wrong by getting rid of the thing you're doing wrong. And so there are several things. They're generally put in the category of sleep hygiene, which normal, healthy people without any disease do wrong all the time, and which costs them sleep. And they either put up with the consequences, which is that they're sleepy and they're impaired, and we'll get into the health issues perhaps a little bit, or they power through it and don't notice that they're impaired and have a problem. But I think the data suggests very much that good sleep results in good thinking, good health, and a lot of other things that we want, and bad sleep undoes many of those things. What's interesting is how it does it. It's not uniform. So if you stay up all night and I stay up all night, we're going to be very different the next morning. One of us may be very, very seemingly normal and performing well, and it takes some subtle testing to demonstrate it, and the other one is completely non-functional. We experience this a lot in situations where people are
right.
forced to not sleep.
Does that depend on physiology or on sleep hygiene as well, or both?
We don't know. We don't know the answer. I think that there are clearly some what we call phenotypes, which is to say people who respond badly to losing their sleep. And
right.
I think if you talk to your friends, you'll run into this all the time. There are people who say, if I don't get my 10 hours of sleep, I just can't function tomorrow. And the other person says, I don't really worry about it because if I don't sleep, nothing happens.
Right.
And that's pretty consistent. It's not something which happens one time and not another, although there's some of that. We don't know if that's physiology or not, and there's been some very interesting data to sort of study that. David Dinges and the group at Penn, who study circadian disruption and various other things, have also studied this directly, and it's very interesting because it's very reproducible. So if you take somebody and you have a specific task, and
right.
you ask them to do it before and after sleep, the people who have trouble when you disrupt their sleep will always have trouble, or most of the time. What's very interesting, however, is that if you change the task, different people have different problems. And this is now very, very simple tasks, things as simple as how fast you can tap your finger, whether you can subtract, in sevens from 100, going 193, and so on.
We're talking about the Mocha test, yeah?
Well, these are all tests that are used in general cognitive behavior, and the assumption is that they all test kind of the same thing, which would be affected by, so your resilience, your ability to function with poor sleep would be the same. And there's a very interesting paper that shows that while it's consistent for each test and for each individual, the same person who's good at one thing after not sleeping is not necessarily doing very well after another test. So it's probably not as simple as saying sleepiness or consequences of poor sleep are all the same. However, globally, I think most of us have an understanding of whether or not we are sensitive to sleep. And there are some people who are very sensitive, other people who are less sensitive. But it's been hard to test that, and we don't know the basis of that because we don't really know how sleep actually produces the benefit that it does. But coming back to your original question, so there's two categories. There's the people who are doing something wrong. There are the people who are continuously changing the time at which they go to bed and when they get up. They are continuously, in a sense, out of sync with their body rhythm. Their body rhythm tends to be very regular and very reproducible, and they are doing things differently. People who stay up late on the weekend and then sleep in all the next day, as opposed to having to go to work at 6 o'clock in the morning and going to bed at 11 o'clock in order to be ready during the week. This is something which the body is not designed to do. And our modern society requests that of you. People do it. It's a compromise. If you have to do it, so be it. I always like to say that, in the caveman days when you were attacked by a Tyrannosaurus Rex, it was a good idea to wake up and run, even if it was the middle of the night.
Absolutely.
And not just say, I can't be bothered now, because that behavior was quickly eliminated.
Yeah.
So again, there are compromises we all do. There's some very interesting literature about people who do round-the-world solo sailing. And there's a sleep researcher who was one of those people.
Interesting.
And who wrote a lot of it. Claudio Stampi wrote a lot of stuff about this. And as you can imagine, if you're alone in a sailboat, you're sailing around the world, you can't take 8 hours to sleep. And so he asked the question.
Do you sleep
over and over
ever?
Again. Well, you have to, because if you don't sleep, you will fall asleep when you don't mean to. And so he asked the question, given that you don't do what your biology is designed to do, what's the best way? Do you take 1 hour out of every 4? Do you take 2 hours out of every 8? Do you take 8 hours and take your chances of being run over by a freighter in the commercial lanes?
Right.
And the answer is there's no one answer. Turns out that different people respond differently to different types of sleep schedules. They're all less good than the one we're designed for. So that comes back to my point. If you can, regularity is very important of good sleep. Another thing that's very important is not to have disturbing influences. And those can be anything from, planes flying over your head because you live near an airport, or noise in the bedroom, a dog that jumps into bed at 2 o'clock in the morning because it wants you to feed it. Whatever it is, these are all things, they're common sense, they're obvious. Right. But the ones that are not as obvious are taking worries to bed with you. So going to bed
That's a big one.
Worrying about it keeps you awake. There's nothing that will wake you up as much as worrying about it. And the worst of those worries is worrying about sleep. So one of the things that, in this age of self-monitoring with Fitbit and your Apple Watch and all these other things, is people have gotten obsessed with how good their sleep is. They're worried about how many minutes am I getting and how many minutes of good sleep and bad sleep and REM sleep and other things. And while some of that is good, knowing what you're doing so that you can correct the obvious, worrying about it excessively actually has produced a whole new syndrome which sleep specialists are dealing with, which is people who are perfectly normal and healthy, but they're coming in worried and losing sleep over what they've been told by their device. And this is now
is there a name for it?
Problem.
Is there a diagnosis for it, or not yet?
There is a name for it. It escapes me at this moment, but it's something which has been talked about a lot at the meetings and so on. And it's a very special kind of insomnia-like a problem. Not all the people are not sleeping, but they're worried about their sleep, and that itself is inducing a stress and an anxiety. So the answer is there are a lot of things you can do wrong. Try not to do them. And if you need the full list, there's a bunch of places where you can look up the word sleep hygiene, and it tells you things that are a good idea not to do. Lots of caffeine before you go to bed, changing your schedule all around, worrying and going to bed, a variety of things along those lines. Now, the other category, which is sort of where you started with the question, is I'm sleeping just fine. What can I do to do better?
Yeah.
That I know very little about, and to the best of my knowledge, there is not much you can do about it, and it's not even clear you should do about it. Your body is extraordinarily good at getting the sleep it needs, and if you feel the next day rested, functional, you're not falling asleep when you don't want to, and everything seems to be going all right, you're getting enough sleep. There is no point in trying to increase your chances of living to 100 by doing something like taking a supplement, getting an extra hour of sleep that you're not already getting. The feedback, and we do this scientifically with formal testing, but you can tell yourself, the feedback that you're getting enough sleep is that you feel good the next day. And if that's happening, your best bet is to just plain forget about sleep and making it better, because it's already good enough. You're getting what you need, and try not to introduce bad habits, obviously, or if you do it for a good reason for a short period of time, meeting a deadline or whatever else. So those two categories, the answers are different. I know you were heading in the direction of, what supplements can I take? What can I do to help me sleep if I'm having minor problems?
So I think to that point, David, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
So basically you wake up and you can monitor how you feel the next day. So basically you can track the hours of sleep that you slept and how you felt the next day, and take the mean basically, and okay, I need 7 or 8 hours of sleep.
So there is some of that, and that is what I was saying, but I do want to put one caveat, and that is that we are notoriously bad at judging how well we are performing. So it's not quite enough to say I'm doing great, by which you mean I'm able to perform in whatever way, intellectually, physically, or otherwise, and I feel good, because one of the things that happens, and this happens with alcohol, but it also happens with sleep, is that people are completely unaware of how impaired they are. Mm-hmm. They usually don't not feel bad, but they'll say, "Oh, I can function just great." I mean, a commercial truck driver, says, "I never fall asleep on the job," or one of us says, "We're doing just great, even though we've only had 3 hours of sleep." It's amazing how badly you may be doing and not knowing it. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about truly feeling well and performing well in a sense, generically, not on a specific task, not being able to, but just feeling good, not thinking about how impaired you might be and denying it. So there's a distinction there.
Got it. All right. What are some of the warning signs of sleep deprivation?
So I think most of us know that the most obvious one is feeling sleepy. Your body has this homeostatic mechanism. The longer you stay awake, the more you need to sleep. It's almost like, there's some kind of toxin that's building up. We've never found a specific one, but there are some candidates that are being investigated for years now. It builds up, and the longer you wait and the more improperly you recover during the time you are sleeping, the more that toxin is there. I mean, if you don't clean up your apartment for weeks and weeks and weeks, it gets pretty dirty. Yeah. And that's really what sleepiness is usually a sign of. Now, that's not the whole story. So it's not as if you just stay up, you'll get sleepy, and if you sleep, you'll get less sleepy. Your body has a second system which says this is a good time to sleep and this is not a good time to sleep. It's based on sunlight, and it's called the circadian clock, and it interacts with the need. So if you stay up all night, most of us have had the experience of getting more and more sleepy, having more and more trouble, and then in the morning we get what we call a second wind, where you stop being sleepy. Now, if it was just a matter of accumulating, you've just spent 8 hours when you should have been sleeping. You've accumulated much more than you had at midnight. You've now got 8 hours more of the accumulated pressure to sleep, and yet you don't feel sleepy. And in fact, by testing, you may be relatively alert. You can do that for a while, and then usually you crash. That whole system interacts with the other system, and it says now's a good time to sleep, now's a bad time to sleep, irrespective of how much you need to sleep. And it can override it for short periods of time. It's at the basis of the dysynchrony between those two things that jet lag occurs. When we say we're jet lagged, it's part that we feel lousy, but it's also that we're unable to sleep at what is outside the room, darkness and night, and a good social time to be asleep. Mm-hmm. And we're unable to be awake at a time when we should be awake, even though we've just not had a good night's sleep. We've just been on a plane, uncomfortable, for 16 hours. We should be really tired, and yet we can't sleep because our internal clock says, this is not the time. Don't try. And it's very difficult to overcome that. Some people have a stronger sense of it. Yes, if you get sleepy enough, you will fall asleep. But that's where these two systems interact.
Yeah.
And so the issue is that if you don't sleep, you will get a signal. And the signal is you feel bad. There's also all sorts of other things you're not aware of. It may have effects on your ability to concentrate and to solve problems and to be creative and a whole lot of other things which are hard to measure, but most people are aware of. It'll have effects on your physical performance. Every coach from high school to the Olympics knows that you have to get a good night's sleep if you want your top performance. And those of us who are runners know that, if you try to run when you haven't had a good night's sleep, you often run more slowly and feel more tired after the run than you do after you've been rested and feel great. There are also long-term effects. Cardiovascular disease seems to be more prevalent in people who have chronic sleep deprivation, either by choice from their schedule or through diseases that disrupt sleep, like sleep apnea. And there may be some other factors, such as inflammation. And interestingly, in this period of COVID, there's some very interesting work that suggests that your immune system is affected by sleep, lack of sleep. And so, for example, it's been shown that if you get a flu vaccine and you're sleep deprived, it's less likely to take. Your antibody response will be less than if you are well rested before you get your vaccine. I don't think anybody's studied COVID vaccines, but I suspect that's true also. And so there's this very, very strong...
That's an odd correlation.
Well, again, sleep is part of good living. And so we translate that into more than just how you feel, but also how the different parts of your body function.
Got it. All right. So, as you know, when peak COVID started early, I was personally redeployed from, research to help in the COVID team under your supervision. Can you tell us about what we did and how you converted a CPAP machine to a life-saving ventilator? That's pretty exciting. So
that was a very interesting period. We were all very stressed because we saw this tidal wave approaching the hospitals. We saw that people were very, very sick in other countries. We started to think about this the minute we heard the first reports from first China and then Italy and certain other countries in Europe, where they were just overwhelmed with people who were very, very sick. And the usual way these people died in most of the reports was that their respiratory system, their breathing apparatus failed. And we know that respiratory failure in its ultimate forms is usually reversible, and so people who have damaged lungs may not recover, but people who have acute infections, if you can tide them through it, will, perhaps recover to the point where what you have to do is you keep them alive.
Right.
And keeping people alive usually involves supporting them at the period where they get the most sick. And that usually involves a ventilator. So a ventilator takes over your breathing completely. It doesn't do anything to cure you, but it keeps you alive while you're hopefully able to respond to medications or to the natural processes of an infection like a virus. So it was very clear, because of the number of people who were coming into the hospital and deteriorating so badly they need ventilators, that this was going to be a major problem. And we made what was in retrospect a wrong call, but we thought that was going to be the limiting factor. We thought hospitals, if they just had more ventilators, could save more lives.
Yeah.
And so all over the world, a lot of people, myself and yourself included, focused on this idea of how can we get more ventilators. And it was very clear we weren't talking about setting up a new factory and doing it a year from now. It had to happen within weeks. And so people looked around for sources. Now, there were a whole group of people, engineers and others, and who designed, 3D printed parts for ventilators.
That was very exciting,
Who repurposed, assembly lines that were making cars and so on to try and make ventilators and so on. And while that all was attractive, a quick and dirty solution was to take something that was almost a ventilator and turn it into one. And that was what you and I were involved in. So I work in sleep apnea research, and one of the treatments we have for sleep apnea is something called a CPAP, or a bilevel machine, which is essentially a pump that delivers compressed air, and it holds the airway open in these people who have collapse of their airway when they go to sleep. All the pieces of a ventilator are there. The thing that's not there is the kind of safety and adjustments and fine-tuning to try and make that usable for a patient who's totally dependent on it. Because the way we use it in sleep apnea is we attach it to a mask, which is a rather tenuous thing. It wouldn't support your life if you depended on it, but it does help you get through a night where your sleep is being disrupted. And there are no alarms. There are certain behaviors of the ventilator which are not anticipated and don't work. And there's no monitoring. So if you were with a very sick patient, you want to know when something goes wrong with an alarm bell going off. Mm-hmm. So what we did is, and there were lots of these machines around that were either not being used or could be rapidly redeployed into life-saving situations.
We got the donation from Elon Musk, right? And Alibaba.
Correct. So when this was identified, there were several sources, but one of the most dramatic ones was we got a couple of hundred of these machines. They were the previous generation, but they were very good, and they were donated to Mount Sinai, and they said, use them as you see best fit. We then tried to put together a package that would allow them to be modified, but more than even being modified, we had to provide a set of instructions because it was expected that we were going to be giving them to people who knew very little about how to use them. So it had to be pretty turnkey. It's kind of like, giving grandma or grandpa a new, well, it used to be a VCR, now it's a computer with a complex interface. That's not enough. You got to teach them to use it. And there was a lot of effort on that. And a lot of people cooperated on this, and it was ultimately useful in that we sent them to some places where they were needed. As I said, this was actually an error that we made, and that is, first of all, it turned out that ventilators weren't really the limiting factor. It was the people who run them and take care of the patients, the nurses, the people who change the beds. All those things were in short supply, and having more ventilators was actually not, in most cases, limiting. Now, in some places it was. There are some countries in the world, in South America, there are several, where they have a total of 2 or 3 ventilators for the whole country. There, this would have been limiting. But in places like Mount Sinai and so on, even when we had 1,000 people with COVID in the hospital,
we had
ventilators, right. It came close. It came close during the surge.
Very close.
But we never actually had to do this. However, the learning that we had and the package we put together and the packing up of these donated ventilators allowed us to ship them off to places that needed them. It was a very heady time, and for many reasons. Obviously, a long way from sleep, but it shows that, if you have some skills and somebody recognizes or you recognize that they're needed, you can quickly redirect them.
Yeah, and it's creative work too, to be honest. It was an experience personally. I'm very thankful for that.
It was a very, very big sort of experience for all of us at a time when there was a lot to be anxious about.
Yeah. All right. So these are the questions that I have for today, Dr. Rapoport. Do you have any last words for the audience so they can listen to you before they sleep and maybe apply it?
Well, I'm not sure who the audience will be, but certainly we can always make a pitch for our field. And as is obvious from what we've been doing, my specialty is respiratory physiology and the things that make us breathe, and the experiments of nature provided by disorders like sleep apnea, which challenge that system, or COVID, which challenges it in a different way.
Yeah.
And learning how to handle those is partly it's medicine, but partly it's also just an opportunity to think how you can benefit things. And the field of sleep is fairly new. We're only 40, 50 years of being recognized as a branch of medicine. There were people studying it before. They've always been interested in sleep all the way back to the Greeks, but not studying it the way we do scientifically. There's a lot left to be learned.
And it's expanding now. Yeah.
Exactly. Starting with exactly what the purpose that makes sleep so important and lack of sleep so damaging to the people who don't sleep. How to control it, what diseases appear during sleep, because after all, we spend a third of our time asleep, and so you'd expect a third of the things that happen to us to happen during sleep. So even if they're not because of sleep, they're during sleep. So there's a lot of room for investigation, and a lot of good that can be done by helping people. I think if we had a pill that cured sleep apnea, or an effective, no side effects treatment for insomnia, which we have some starting treatments for, not just drugs. These are things that would help a lot of people. And just as we tried to help people with COVID, you have to direct them at the right thing. But I would make a pitch for people who have an interest in science, an interest in medicine, and so on, to put sleep on their radar as an area that's worth investigating. There's a lot left to be done. And it doesn't take very much to get to the edge of our knowledge, which is always fun for an investigator, because then you can contribute something without having to wade through large amounts of what's already known and established.
Great. Dr. Rapoport, that was amazing and highly valuable. Thank you so much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching episode 1 with my guest, Dr. Rapoport. See you in the next one.
Thank you.